Good afternoon, everyone. Kumusta po kayong lahat? We hope that everyone is well and safe. Today, we will be tackling a very relevant and important topic on the human rights situation in the country. Ako po si Jermaine Halandoni de Junya, ang inyong host ngayong programang ito. Welcome po sa ating webinar, ang Philippine Terror Law and its Implication on Rights and Civic Space. This webinar is organized by Karapatan together with the Ecumenical Voice for Human Rights and Peace in the Philippines, or Eco Voice, and is being streamed live via Facebook pages of Karapatan and Eco Voice. So please like and share this very informative discussion as widely as possible. We would also like to acknowledge the presence of the British, German, Swiss, and Belgian embassies and the European Union. Maraming salamat po muli sa inyong pagsama sa ating talakayan ngayong araw. Last July 2020, President Rodrigo Duterte signed the new Anti-Terrorism Act, or Republic Act number 11479, at a time when we needed better health services, mass testing, contact tracing, better facilities and services for our frontliners to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before the pandemic, a so-called human rights crisis has already emerged in the country, with thousands killed in the drug war and with the attacks, including killings, arrests, and red tagging against critics, dissenters, journalists, lawyers, church workers, human rights workers, and political opposition. The ATA was seen as a measure that will further suppress dissent. Many took to the streets and on online platforms to express opposition to the ATA, and a record number of 37 petitions have been filed at the Supreme Court, questioning the constitutionality of the ATL. During the first half of this year, oral arguments were held at the Supreme Court. Petitioners raised issues on the overbroad and vague definitions of terrorism and on the mandate and functions of the Anti-Terrorism Council and the possible infringement on basic rights and fundamental freedoms. Prior to the ATA, there was the Human Security Act of 2007, which was supplanted by ATA and Republic Act number 10168, or the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012. Together with the ATA, this is the landscape of counter-terror legislation in the country. Joining us today are our guests whose organizations, clients, or loved ones have been impacted by these counter-terror legislation for defending and upholding people's rights and welfare, and human rights advocates who have monitored the impact of such laws in the Philippines and globally. We have with us during the first segment, Bishop Hamuel Tequis of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, or UCCP. We also have Ms. Cathy Estavillo of Amihan, or the National Federation of Peasant Women, and Fides Lim, spokesperson of Kapatid, an organization of families and friends of political prisoners in the Philippines, and wife of detained National Democratic Front of the Philippines Peace Consultant Vicente Ladlad. Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat at salamat po sa pagsama sa atin dito ngayong hapon na ito. And later, we will be joined by Cristina Palabay, Secretary General of Karapatan, Attorney Rachel Pastores of the Public Interest Law Center, or PILC, and Joseph Benedict, Civic Space Researcher of Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation. Civicus is a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizens' action in civil society throughout the world. Magandang hapon po. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hi, you may turn on your cameras na po so our viewers can see. Thank you again for joining us. Out to our guests, thank you so much for being here and discussing this very important topic and very befitting in our situation today. So my first question, let's start the discussion na po. No? My first question is to Bishop Hamuel, Ms. Cathy, and Ms. Fides. Even before po the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act, you, your organization, your loved ones, or even your clients po have experienced various forms of attacks. Can you tell us how bad it was before the passage of the anti-terror law? Simulan ko po. Let's start with Bishop Hamuel.
Good afternoon to all, especially to the organizers of this gathering. The topic, Philippine terror law and its implications on rights and civic space. I would like to share the experience of various forms of attacks in our vicinity, especially at UCC Piharan, together with our dear Lumads who are in the sanctuary. Actually, the church supports the Lumads to seek refuge in UCC Piharan since 1994 up to the present. With our strong stand for the poor, red tagging through tarpaulin hanging and in Facebook, stating statements that are not true, like we are terrorists, spokesperson of the NPA, child abusers, and human traffickers. Trump up charges in the form of filing cases against some leaders of the Lumads and church leaders, the bishops, pastors, and lay leaders are continuing up to this present time. Most of the cases filed against us since 2018 up to the present are child abuse of the Lumads, violations of the international humanitarian law, human trafficking, sanitation, and violation of mandatory reporting. Another form of attacks in us inside Haran UCCP was the incident of forcible entry within the sanctuary have been carried out by the government authorities since 2015. First was the Nancy Katamko incident in February 2015, which she was still the representative and the chairperson of the Indigenous Peoples Committee in the Congress. She authorized the PNP to assault the Lumads in Haran, forcing the Lumads to go back home. The attack has brought the Lumads fear, trauma, and with sleepless night experience, and series of red tagging among us in the sanctuary. The leaders of the Lumads, the church leaders, are very rampant. Second was the incident in January 2020 when Governor Edwin Hubahib of Davao del Norte authorized the Alamara forces to attack the Haran compound and were backed up by the military personnel under Eastern Mindanao Command. He urged the Lumads to go back to their homelands because, according to him, the government of Davao del Norte is making developmental programs for them to avail of. But the Lumads declined the entire offer from the governor because the primary demands of the Lumads are not addressed. It was not answered or realized. This is our experience and many, many more. So, as church people, even though there are many attacks, we are very sincere and committed to serve our Lumad people because this is the mandate of our service as God entrusted to us. So that's our experience, Ma'am Jermaine.
Thank you so much, Bishop Tekis, and I'm really sorry to hear those experiences that you've been experiencing for the past years, even before the passage of this anti-terror law. That's very saddening, and thank you for being here and telling us those experiences. And now let's hear po from Ms. Kathy Estavillo of Amian. How was your experience even prior to the passage of this anti-terror law?
Good afternoon sa lahat ng nasa Zoom room. Good afternoon sa ating mga guests. Magsasalita ako ng Tagalog para mas ma-express ko yung mga nangyayari sa sa sektor ng mga magsasaka, lalong-lalo na sa sektor ng mga kababaihang magsasaka, no? Napakamakasaysayan yung araw na itong forum dahil ngayong araw din ay araw ito nung paglabas ng desisyon ng Korte Suprema dun sa napaka-controversial na anti-terror law kung saan bahagi ang amihan sa petitioner, no, petitioner. At ito yung napakatinding epekto nito sa buhay ng mga aktivista sa mga iba't ibang organisasyon, no, na kung saan ay matindi yung paglaban dun sa iba't ibang mga proyekto, programa ng rehimeng Duterte. Kung meron man talagang naapektuhan dito sa anti-terror law at yung iba't ibang patakaran tulad ng NTF-ELCAC, SEMPO, Executive Order 72, MO 32, ay walang iba kundi ang mga magsasaka. Walang iba kundi ang mga magsasaka na tuloy-tuloy yung naranasan sa pagteredtag, pagkulong, pagsampa ng mga gawang-gawang kaso, at sa ilalim lang ng rehimeng Duterte ay umaabot na sa 333 victims ng extrajudicial killings at 25 massacres sa hanay ng mga magsasaka. Dito sa 333 farmer victims ng extrajudicial killings ay 42 dito ay mga magsasakang kababaihan at 63 ay nakakulong, no, nakakulong sa iba't ibang kulungan sa buong bansa. Ang yung EGK pala na okay. Yung EGK mula 2016 hanggang 2020 prior to dun sa enactment ng anti-terror law ay 37, no, 37, at yung at present na ngayon ay umaabot na ng 44 victims ng peasant women EGKs, no. Tapos 57 ang political prisoners na peasant women. Nakakagalit dahil yung mga political prisoners na mga kababaihan ay mga matatanda na may mga sakit, no, at may mga ilang namatay sa kulungan dahil dun sa pagkasakit, dahil sa sakit, no. At nakita natin yung kung gaano yung halos araw-araw ay meron nadudukot, may pinapatay dahil dito sa anti-terror law. At ang lahat ng ito ay sa yung matinding krisis na nararanasan natin sa panahon ng pandemya. Nakita natin na sa kabila ng pandemya ay tuloy-tuloy yung implementasyon ng mga neoliberal policies na talagang nakakaapekto dun sa buhay ng mga magsasaka. Nakita natin na sa gitna ng pandemya ay sinusunog yung bahay ng mga magsasaka, pinapasok at yung maliban sa pagsunog ay matinding displacement sa mga magsasaka doon sa kanilang kabuhayan at saka paninirahan dahil dito sa build projects. At masasabi natin na matinding pambubusabos ang ginagawa ng rehimeng Duterte sa hanay ng mga magsasaka, at itong pangbubusabos na ito talagang hinarap ito ng mga magsasaka sa pamamagitan ng kanilang pagkakaisa, pag-oorganisa at pagdemand sa gobyerno ng reforms. Pero ang naging sagot ng gobyerno ay yung matinding harassment, matinding pagpatay, pagkulong, pagsampa ng mga gawgawang kaso, pagdukot sa kanila. So ito lahat ay isang pinakikita lang na ang gobyerno ay talagang ang kanyang pinaglilingkuran ay yung mga bansang mga imperialistang bansa, no. So mula dito ay yung mga leaders ng mga magsasaka, leaders ng mga kababaihan ay sa ngayon, yung halos yung aming mga National Council leaders sa Cagayan, sa Isabela, sa Bicol, sa Mindoro, hanggang sa Visayas ay nare-red-tag na. May mga tarpaulins, may mga sako na nakalagay sa mga highways, na sila ay mga recruiter ng mga NPA, sila ay mga membro ng NPA. So mula dyan ay tuloy-tuloy yung pagkampanya namin. Mayroon kampanya ang amihan, ito yung Defend Peasant Women, dahil sa tindi ng nararanasan ngayon ng mga kababaihan sa mga chapters ng amihan. Sa Cagayan ay mass surrenderies ang ginagawa ng mga militar, no? So sabi ng mga magsasakang kababaihan ay ayaw man nila, pero talagang naiipit sila dun sa mga pressure, sa mga pang-araw-araw na pagpunta ng militar sa kanilang mga bahay. Kaya napipilitan talaga sila na pumirma sa mga papel na pinapalaganap, na pinapapirma sa kanila. Ngayon, itong recently na June 3, pumunta ako sa bangko para i-deposit yung isang donasyon na ibinigay ng isang kaibigan, no? Doon ko nalaman na sabi nung sa bangko, BPI, na frozen na daw yung account.
Miss Cathy? Opo, Miss Cathy, we're going to discuss po natin later deeply po na mas deeper level po yung pag-freeze po ng mga accounts. Thank you very much po for sharing that. So for our listeners and viewers po on Facebook, no, according to Ms. Cathy, many peasants, including women, po have been killed prior to the terror law, and they have experienced red tagging. Homes of peasants have been burned. They have been displaced due to so-called development projects. And it's very, very saddening to hear this, because our farmers are our food producers, and we badly need food during this pandemic. And this is happening even prior to the passage of the anti-terror law. Again, thank you, Ms. Cathy, for sharing that to us. Thank you so much. Kayo naman po, Ma'am Fides, how bad was it in your experience po during, even before the passage of this anti-terror law?
Hello, Jermaine and
Yes, po.
everyone. No? We in Kapatid, no, we draw our main membership from families of political prisoners like myself. I can speak for us all when I say that when your loved one gets jailed, you're like a political prisoner yourself. You become a prisoner of dread, which is worse than fear. In my case, when my husband, Vicente Ledlad, was arrested on November 8, 2018, and was missing in the early hours of that morning, it was a living hell. When I found him in the hands of the police and found out that firearms and grenades were planted on him to keep him in jail, I steeled myself for a long haul. This is not the first time Vic has been a political prisoner, but you never get used to it. The Anti-Terrorism Act has made that feeling of dread a permanent state for every activist and their family, because of a regime that has declared total war on activism, genocidal, especially against leftist leaders. Now, what forms of attack have provided the blueprint for creating political prisoners like Vic? They now number more than 700. First comes the red tagging that sets up one for arrest through posters, newspapers, and online. Then come the search warrants that carry out the actual arrest or even a kill. The trumped-up criminal cases follow, especially planted explosives, because this is non-bailable. Then, during the court hearing, the manufactured witnesses appear. In the case of Vic and some other political prisoners, the witnesses were led by no less than, guess who? The National Security Advisor and Vice Chair of the Anti-Terrorism Council himself, General Esperon. The ATA has made things worse because it has legalized all these illegal acts. For us families, the psychosocial burden is aggravated by the pandemic, since we still cannot visit from March since last year, while the political prisoners face constant threat not only from COVID, but the machinations of the NTF-ELCAP, which serves as the core of the Terror Council. I call it the Terror Council because that's what it does, because that's what it is. It inflicts terror through lawfare because activism and truth are inconvenient to their abuse of power.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Fides, for that. No, and very interesting, 700 political prisoners even prior to this anti-terror law. And to add to that, it really degrades the humanity not only of the political prisoner, but as well as their family and friends. Thank you so much, Ms. Fides, for sharing that to us. So all of you here in our panel have experienced their bank accounts or even their organizations, their loved ones' bank accounts being frozen. This was briefly discussed earlier by Ms. Kathy. Can you tell us how this happened and what steps are you taking to move forward or move from this? Let's start with, once again, Bishop Hamuel.
Good afternoon once again to all viewers and organizers. Our experience on the freezing of our bank account, we start at last March 28, 2021. The Philippine News Agency, or PNA, has reported about the order issued by the Anti-Money Laundering Council, the freezing of our bank account of UCCP Haran. So we made a pastoral statement on dated March 30, 2021. Our church deplores in the strongest term the recent order issued by the Anti-Money Laundering Council, freezing the bank deposit and assets of a religious group center allegedly used to finance or support terrorism. The order covers the 3 bank accounts of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, UCCP Haran Center, with Philippine National Bank amounting to more or less 600,000, referring to UCCP Haran in Davao City, as quoted from the report released by the Philippine News Agency on March 28, 2021. What makes such order ludicrous is the fact that UCCP Haran has only 1 bank account with Philippine National Bank Ateneo de Davao branch, and with only insignificant amount of 72,275.91 centavos, which is way below the threshold set forth in the anti-money laundering law, with a little over 70,000 in bank. How in the world can UCCP Haran finance terrorism? On May 24, 2021, the Anti-Money Laundering Council filed to the Court of Appeals a verified petition for extension, the fresh order. The Court of Appeals issued to the AMLAC that their petition for extension of fresh order of UCCP Haran is held in abeyance because there was a post-issuance hearing conducted by the Court of Appeals to be attended by the petitioners, the AMLAC, Office of the Solicitor General, and the respondents, the respondents. This happened last May 27, 2021, through Zoom meeting. I attended a Zoom meeting together with our lawyer, and we presented our arguments related to the false accusation of AMLAC that UCCP Haran was involved in financing terrorism. In the fresh order, we found out that there are 2 accounts that were included in the fresh order, and the land of UCCP Haran was also included in the fresh order. In our case conference with our lawyers and the lawyer of UCCP Bohol, because part of the freezing account was the UCCP Bohol, our church in Bohol, we found out that the other bank accounts of Haran that was frozen by AMLAC is not our bank account, but this is the bank account of UCCP Bohol. Our lawyers and the lawyer of UCCP Bohol make legal action on this matter. This is a shameless act of harassment against the church of UCCP Bohol and UCCP Haran. AMLAC or any state agencies for that matter has no right whatsoever to deprive the church of its mission, much more to accuse it for faithfully doing its mission of providing a refuge for the poor and the oppressed nomads who had to abandon their ancestral communities because of threats against their lives. The freezing of our bank account in UCCP Haran and the freezing of our property in Haran is really an act of harassment against the church, as well as the Lumad community inside the evacuation sanctuary at Haran. This is also destroying the image of the church in its mission to serve the poor people who are oppressed exploited, and deprived. This is a violation of human rights, especially in the separation of the church and state. The freezing of our bank account give us a very difficult situation in the affairs of the church. That account in the bank amounting to 72,000 is for the payment of our electric bills and water bills monthly. The freezing of our property in Haran is a kind of harassment of the Lumads in order that they will be forced to leave the place and forced to go back to their homelands, even their lives are in danger. Our plans for development in Haran, especially infrastructure projects, have been stopped because of the freeze order. So
Yes,
this
po.
is our situation here, and some other sharing mamaya na siguro po.
Thank you po, Bishop. Thank you so much for that response po. No? As you can see, it's yung lawfare po no, in action, using the law to suppress dissent no, and helping out yung mga ating mga human rights defenders. Sa kaso naman po ng asawa niyo po, Ma'am Fides, paano po ito nangyari? How was the bank account frozen? And what are the steps that you're currently taking?
Yeah, no. Itong civic, no, he has always been a magnet of attack, especially because of his public role as a peace consultant of the National Democratic Front. On May 10, Monday, I was presiding over a kapatid meeting when I got a call from Land Bank. I felt something was going on because why would the manager call me about the mere updating of personal records? My hunch was proven right when I learned the Land Bank head office received inquiries from the Anti-Money Laundering Council or AMLAC about Vic's account. On May 13, General Esperon announced the issuance of Resolution number 17 on the terrorist listing. Then on May 17, the Land Bank branch informed me Vic's accounts had been frozen on the basis of that resolution. But let me point this out. First, in August 2019, Manila Regional Trial Court, Branch 19, had already dropped Vic's name from a government petition filed on March 2018 to prescribe 600 individuals as terrorists. Second, how can a prisoner for 2 years and 8 months carry out NPA attacks and supply arms from the topmost special intensive care area, Sikawan, in Bikutan for high-risk prisoners? Third, the Land Bank itself told me they defended the account of Vic as coming from government funds. Why? Because it consists solely and purely of the compensation Vic received in 2018 under Republic Act 10368, otherwise known as the Human Rights Victims Reparation and Recognition Act of 2013, plus the compensation from Attorney Robert Swift in August 2019 in reparation for Vic's political imprisonment and torture during martial law, and for the enforced disappearance of his first wife, Leticia Pascual Ladlad, in 1975. In short, that Land Bank account is blood money. I went to the BSP on May 24, that's the Central Bank of the Philippines, to see BSP Governor Benjamin Jokno, who's concurrent AMLAC chair, but I was told to just give my letter. I've now written several times, Governor Jokno, to explain the official progeny or origin of Vic's Land Bank account and to appeal to him to lift the freeze order because Vic is very sick and needs his compensation for medicines, and because it's wrongful, immoral, reprehensible to perpetuate the injustice and tragedy that the law sought to atone for and indemnify. In fact, the only illegal use of that account transpired right after Vic's arrest by police forces on November 8, 2018, when Land Bank sent me an alert text on my cell phone suspending the attached ATM card as preventive measure against unauthorized transactions. Now, the AMLA, under Rule 16 of the IRR, has a prohibition against political persecution and harassment. But Governor Jokno just sent off my letters to AMLA and the BSP office, called the Consumer Protection and Market Conduct Office, strategic communication, and advocacy, which likewise directed me to AMLAC. AMLAC told me to just go to the Court of Appeals and to the ATC to file for delisting or for humanitarian exception to access the frozen funds. But this is my question. Why be made to go through hoops before a council that has already prejudged and criminalized Vic? The head himself, as I have said, no, virtually, no, he may be the vice chair, but we know who really heads it, no? I listen to advice, but I put the burden on the BSP, which heads the AMLA. Let them undo the injustice. Please unfreeze Vic's compensation account.
Thank you, Ms. Fides, for that. Like what seems bureaucracy and hoops that you had to went through to address the issue that internet here in our country is very unstable, and it's also raining from where I am right now. Thank you so much, Ma'am Fides, for that sharing. So, Ms. Cathy, maaari nyo na pong ituloy yung inyong sharing po kanina regarding dun po sa pag-freeze ng inyong pong account. Nakamute po kayo, ma'am.
Actually, June 3 ay nire-red tag na talaga ang amihan at bantay bigas, lalong-lalo na nung panahon ng mainit ang issue ng bigas, yung pag-implement ng rice liberalization law ay talagang tuloy-tuloy yung pag-red tag ng gobyerno ng NTF-ELCAC sa amihan, no? So nitong June 3, pumunta ako sa bangko para mag-deposit ng i-deposit yung donasyon na ibinigay sa amihan para doon sa campaign ng para sa kampanyang isinasagawa ng amihan. So nung nag-sign ako ng deposit slip, pagdating ko sa teller ay sinabi niya na close yung account. Pumunta ako doon sa officer at sinabi din niya na frozen yung account. So nagtaka ako at nanghingi ako ng papers, mga materials, bakit na-froze yung account ng amihan. Wala siyang maisagot at maghintay na lang daw kami ng sulat from the National BPI office sa Makati. So nagtaka na kami dahil bakit of all organization ang account pa ng amihan ang i-freeze. Meron kaming dalawang account sa BPI at ito ay peso at saka dollar account. At naghintay kami, so June 8, dumating yung sulat mula sa AMLAC stating na frozen na nga yung account namin. At doon sa sulat ng AMLAC ay meron din resolution ang Court of Appeal na yung pag-freeze ng aming account ay i-extend hanggang 6 months, no? So nagbasa-basa kami at kasabay nung pag-freeze ng account ng Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women ay may 8 account, NGO account sa Mindanao na nabanggit doon yung iba't ibang mga NGOs na frozen at kasama doon sa na-freeze ay Amihan NMR, no? Amihan NMR at saka RMP, yung mga ganyan. Doon sa binigay nilang reason sa pag-freeze ng account ng amihan ay ito ay galing sa dalawang babaeng sabi ay rebel returnee at binanggit yung pangalan, ilang beses binanggit yung pangalan na amihan at nag-finance ng mga terrorist act ng CPP-NPA. So nung nakita namin yun at tinignan namin yung accounts na inilagay dun under Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women ay kasama naisama dun sa account na sa ilalim ng Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women ay bangko ng RCBC at BDO. Pero sa realidad, sa totoong buhay ay wala kaming BDO at saka RCBC. So mula dyan ay humingi kami ng mga statements o humingi kami ng certification from these banks like RCBC na wala talaga kaming account doon para idagdag doon sa mga basis na mali yung nilagay sa amihan, no? Sa under Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women. So doon sa bank account na na-freeze ay ang laman ng peso ay almost 50,000 na yun ay para sa aming administrative cost. Meron din laman yung dollar account na 2,600 na ito ay yung ongoing project on agroecology project sa isang chapter ng Amihan, no? So napakasakit na yung project na yan ay na-freeze. Kung titignan natin yung nagbigay ng testimony na ito ay isang hearsay at naniwala kaagad ang AMLAC, no? Dahil doon sa testimony nila ay walang probable cause, no? First, yung Amihan na financing terrorism, wala siyang sufficient evidence to pin down Amihan dahil walang means no ipakita, napaka-general yung pagsabi na Amihan financing terrorism activities. Walang parang when, where, amount na ipinadala, yung ganun. So yung napakalabo yung kanilang mga dahilan doon sa pagsabi na kami ay nagfi-finance sa terorista. Pangalawa, yung Amihan NMR ay may sariling distinct, may sarili siyang board, may sarili siyang program na hindi alam ng Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women. May sarili siyang SEC paper, hindi Amihan National Federation of Peasant Women ang ginamit. So anong basis para isama kami dun sa mga banks na i-freeze? So sa bahagi ng Amihan, ito ay kampanya ng Rehimeng Duterte dun sa lumalawak at lumalakas na kampanya ng mga magsasaka para manawagan na dapat ang mga policies and programs ng gobyerno ay magsisilbi, no, sa interest ng mamamayang Pilipino. Dapat ang Amihan ay kilala for 34 years, kilala ang Amihan na nagsusulong sa interest ng mga kababaihang magsasaka, ng mga interest ng mga magsasaka. At higit sa lahat ay yung pondo ng Amihan ay napakaliit na halos pang everyday maintenance lang.
Opo, let's discuss that po later, no? Kasi may tatanong din po akong tanong na related po dyan, no?
Okay.
So for our next, salamat po, Ms. Cathy, for sharing. For our next question po, for our panelists here, how do you all view this recent freezing and or designation po and use of counter-terror laws? No, has this affected you, your families, your organizations, and most importantly, the communities that you serve? Let's start with Ma'am Fides. Ma'am, can you hear us?
Yeah. For me, the lighting is very strong here, no? Every activist or critic and their family will have a bank account, no? No matter how modest, it's not even the account, it's not even the amount that matters, no? You have reason to fear, to dread.
Yes.
The Terror Council has shown why the ATA should be struck down when, without waiting for the Supreme Court's decision on its constitutionality, it demonstrated its superpowers to target even those already imprisoned and to freeze even human rights compensation accounts like that of Vic. The cold-blooded murder of 7 NDF consultants who are in fact hors de combat, sick and retired, and the wanted posters I have seen online with the names of Vic Ladlad, my husband, and Ray Casambre and Adele Silva aggravate my worry. They are already in jail Why label them wanted? I have requested the CHR and likewise, I request the ICRC to regularly monitor the condition of Vic and the other political prisoners. They are not safe inside Duterte's dungeons, where prisoners have ended up dead in incredulous police shootouts. I'd like to note this, no? The left has historically always been the first to experience the brunt of human rights violations, politically motivated arrests and imprisonment, extrajudicial killings, and now the freezing of bank accounts. The reverse of the climate of impunity is the rule of law, but domestic mechanisms are not holding up anymore in the Philippines when military-led councils like the ATC serve as judge, jury, and jailer, when court judges turn into a search warrant factory, and when those who judge rightly but get red tagged blatantly, while the Supreme Court sits on petitions for the protection of human rights and human life. But maybe, no, just maybe, I still can make an appeal direct to BSP Governor Jokno. As concurrent AMLAC chair, you have the power and the authority to unfreeze what AMLAC has done. The power of freezing includes the power of unfreezing. The activists are not your problem. Make the AMLAC go after the 15 billion pesos of stolen PhilHealth funds, the more than 32 billion pesos in cash brought in by 60 people from September 2019 to March 2020, the 14 billion pesos suspicious POGO transactions, and how about the plundered wealth of Imelda Marcos, Enrile, Gloria, Erap, etc. BSP Governor Jokno, don't allow your office to likewise become a tool of political persecution. Prove your independence and honor. Prove that your signature is worth it on every peso bill of this country.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Fides, for sharing po. Punta naman po tayo kay Bishop Tekis. How did the freezing po of your accounts affected your communities? You briefly mentioned this earlier po. Can you elucidate further on this?
Yeah. We really experience hardships in continuing our mission because we need financial support, especially on our water bills and electric bills, and some needs for our mission work. Now, especially now that the Court of Appeals gave the extension order to AMLAC for 5 months. Now, our account, which is stated here, that the bank account of UCCP Bohol is included in our bank accounts. That's the problem. We really feel fear with regards to UCCP property, not only in UCCP Haran, but our property in not only our bank accounts, but the property in Haran, because it really affects the lives of our lumads who are now in our sanctuary. Now, with this, we are hoping that our lawyers can do some measures to solve these AMLAC issues. And even though, despite of these realities and situation, we are challenged to be strong. To be strong, that our spirit of serving the least, the lost and the last of our brothers and sisters, especially the lumads, will remain steadfast in our commitment to serve. We are called to be faithful in doing Christ's mission of providing a refuge for the poor and the lumads who are oppressed and exploited in their own lands. The red tagging, harassment, freezing of our bank account and property, filing against the church leaders, the lumads, and peace advocates cannot hinder us to pursue the call of our Lord to serve the poor people. I personally believe that God has plans for me, for us, and for this situation. The church will never cease in doing its mission towards the total transformation of our society. I, being a steward of God's creation, will never cease in pursuing the mission of God to help the poor, oppressed,
Opo.
exploited, and deprived women, youth, children, minority groups, and other persons who cannot safeguard their own rights.
Thank you po.
Yeah.
Yes po. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off po, no? Bishop, thank you so much for sharing it. It's very clear that the communities that you are serving are the ones who are directly affected by the freezing of your accounts. Thank you so much. Ma'am Kathy, maaari niyo na pong ipagpatuloy. Let's continue po yung sharing niyo regarding how the freezing affected the communities and your organization. You're on mute po, ma'am. Naka-mute pa po kayo.
Yung pag-freeze ng aming account, account ng amihan ay nagresulta ito no ng paghinto nung pag-implement ng project, and at the same time yung everyday, gaya ng nabanggit ni Bishop, yung everyday needs namin sa administrative costs ay talagang nahihirapan kami. Ganun din parang doon sa pag-freeze ng account ay tinanggalan na ng karapatan yung amihan na mag-receive ng mga donations para sa aming mga gawain, no? At ito ay i-challenge namin hanggang sa Supreme Court dahil walang batayan yung pag-freeze doon sa account, at walang batayan na nag-finance kami ng terrorism activities, no? So nakapag-file na kami nung June 22, nag-file kami ng motion para hingin yung mga dokumento, yung batayan nila kung bakit na-freeze yung account ng amihan, at nanghingi din ng extension para sa pag-file namin ng motion dahil wala kaming data kung hanggang saan kinalkal yung aming mga documents, no? So ongoing yung discussion namin sa abogado at kino-consolidate namin yung mga fund disposal namin para ipakita na ito lang yung pondo ng amihan. Puro yan campaigns and at the same time yung administrative costs.
Opo.
So kompleto naman tayo dyan, kaya sa Wednesday, July 8 ay magpa-file kami ng memorandum of statements na ilalagay na namin doon yung iba't ibang basis na dapat hindi i-freeze yung bangko ng amihan. At very clear ang sinesend ng Rehimeng Duterte, yung pag-freeze ng account, kung hindi natin lalabanan ito, kung hindi natin i-expose, ay hindi lang mangyayari sa Haran, sa UCCP, sa amihan, kundi lahat ng mga POs, NGOs na nagki-criticize sa government programs and policies ay tiyak magiging kaparehos sila nung nangyari sa amihan.
Opo. Thank you po, Ma'am Kathy. Even yung inyo pong administrative costs, the operations of your office have been affected because of the freezing of this account. Thank you so much, Ms. Kathy, for that. Now let's go to this question. I wanted to ask this question to Ms. Tinay. You've already heard, we've heard the stories of our guests they shared earlier. And how do you locate po the experiences of those who spoke earlier in the context of human rights in the Philippines and how it is used to go after dissenters, especially during the last the Duterte presidency?
Maraming salamat, Jermaine, and I think we are all experiencing thunderstorms wherever we are here, at least here in Metro Manila. Well, we have heard our fellow panelists today and what they have pointed out, the arbitrary listing, the lack of due process, the stigmatization, the violation on their rights have all been said when the terror law was being deliberated upon by both houses of Congress as the dangerous impacts of the said legislation. But let me stress the following. Number one, with the Anti-Terrorism Council drawing up lists of whoever it designates as terrorists without showing clear, credible, competent, and admissible evidence, it is putting the lives of those in their lists in danger. And it is virtually acting as judge, jury, and executioner, and it is violating the right to due process of those whom they endanger. With the law having a vague and overbroad definition of terrorism, anyone can be included in that list. Secondly, Jermaine, with the use of the laws to purportedly counter terrorism, the humanitarian and advocacy work and functions of the nonprofit organizations, RMP, the UCCP, the AMIHAN, are all affected, violating not only their right to due process, but their right to receive and have resources for their development and human rights works. This directly violates their rights under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Human Rights Defenders. We cannot but underscore how this affects the landscape being navigated in by human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and social movements. Because all of this happens in the context of the red tagging spree, the judicial harassment, the use, thus the use of the said laws cannot be treated as a one-off, no, or isolated incidents. One cannot simply aver anymore that the only those who will be affected are the so-called Reds, no? Simply because they have gone after almost every dissenting, protesting voice. To show the impact, no, of this terrorist tagging and consequently the laws that have been used against those against activists and political dissenters, Karapatan has documented many cases of red tagging, which comes as prelude to various killings. As of June 2020, we documented 409 individuals who have been branded as terrorists before they were killed. And majority of them are peasants and indigenous peoples and workers. There are currently 713 political prisoners, 487 of them arrested under this administration, including Mr. Ladlad, and thousands more face threats, intimidation, and harassment. This recent phenomenon of filing charges against those alleged to be financing, quote-unquote, financing terrorism, and the freezing of their bank accounts are lamentably just the tip of the iceberg. It can go on and be normalized as a policy and practice of harassment of political dissenters and even mere humanitarian actors. And for what ends, you ask? We think it is to disrupt their work. It is meant to defame their reputations. It is meant to derail them from their objectives for human rights and their various advocacies. It is meant to silence them. It is meant to silence everyone who dare speak out and act for social justice and human rights. More importantly, I think it is meant to normalize a climate of silencing, of fear, and of impunity. And for what purpose? We can only surmise that it is to promote the kind of governance and the terrible human rights situation that we have nowadays. These acts and many more acts inciting violence or using violence against civilians are being promoted to the hilt, lamentably, especially since the national and local elections loom, and the many actors right now are positioning themselves in this exercise. But more strategically, such use of counter-terror policies have long-term impacts on the exercise of rights and fundamental freedoms. It can lead to further weaponization of laws against activists and dissenters. It can lead to further infringement of the freedom of thought and of free expression. It can lead to a martial law regime where military rule and the state policy of securitization makes the people's faces increasingly more insecure for the exercise of rights and democracy. At the end of all these trends and patterns that we're looking at, is essentially the narrowing of the democratic spaces, what's left of it, right now in the country. So this is not just an issue of Ms. Fides Lim or of Amihan or UCCP. This is an issue that touches on the democratic fabric, that should be ingrained in our constitution and in our laws.
All right, thank you, Ms. Tina. Apologies for that. The rain is getting harder here. So thank you for that, Ms. Tina. I'd like to reiterate what you said. This is the limiting of the democratic space and the apologies for that. I think we're all experiencing rain and thunderstorms as of the moment. So it's limiting our democratic space and also the use of lawfare in suppressing dissent. Thank you again, Ms. Tina. Attorney Rachel, what is the implication of being accused of financing terrorism in terms of civil liberties?
Okay, thank you, Jermaine. But before I answer your question, I would like to say first that, as you said earlier, there are 37 petitions currently pending before the Supreme Court questioning the constitutionality of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. And I am one of the lawyers of one of the petition of the 37 petitions before the Supreme Court. And I would just like to say that we were directed not to discuss the merits of the matter, particularly the constitutionality of the ATA while it is being deliberated upon by the Supreme Court. It is now actually submitted for resolution and to the Supreme Court. So I cannot, with that limitation, maybe I can focus on the acts of the Anti-Money Laundering Council, because recently, although the anti-terrorism law is being deliberated before the Supreme Court, the Anti-Money Laundering Council continued to freeze assets of private organizations, people's organizations, or NGOs. And the most recent was the Task Force Resolution number 38, series of 2021, wherein about 9 organizations whose accounts were frozen by the Anti-Money Laundering Council pursuant to Republic Act 10168, or the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012. And this is the law that is being used actually by AMLC in freezing the accounts of many organizations. We are yet to see actually the filing of cases regarding anti-terrorism law, but they're using RA 10168. So perhaps I can focus on that a little bit. Now, regarding the question on the impact of the freezing of assets on civil society or civil liberties, I think we all agree that civil society plays a critical role in holding governments accountable, in ensuring good governance and promoting all human rights, including social, economic, and cultural rights. And civil society sees to it that the government recognize these fundamental freedoms through their laws and actions. Okay, and as Bishop Tekis described, we all agree that financial resources or support are necessary to be able to perform their works and programs and reach out to their beneficiaries. So if their bank accounts are frozen, that would naturally impact on their activities and on how they would reach out to their beneficiaries and perform their missions and functions. Okay. Actually, Tinay already enumerated a lot of issues that impact on the civil liberties, the effect of the anti-terrorism law. It is the same with the freezing of assets. The agency responsible in the freezing of assets or bank accounts is the Anti-Money Laundering Council. And as I've said earlier, the law that is being used is Republic Act 10168, or the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012. The freezing of assets, according to the government, is a measure, okay, to combat terrorism by undermining its financial basis. However, there is a big problem, because if this measure is being used against civil society or people's organizations and not really on the so-called terrorists, That is why a lot of organizations are complaining, because if the law can be used against civil society, against ordinary individuals, against people's organizations, together with the, as we can say, real terrorists, for example, then we have a problem with that law, right? Because it can be used discriminately. So the concerns of people's organizations with respect to freezing of accounts, as Tinay, I think, have already mentioned a lot, is the first is the due process concerns, because the freeze order is issued ex parte by the Anti-Money Laundering Council, and there is lack of notification. The basis of the freezing is based on secret evidence, and we are not given privilege to look into the basis or process in the issuance of the freeze order. It is an administrative agency, okay, that issues the freeze order, unlike when it is issued by a court where there is a judicial intervention. The impact is hard because I should say, results in the infringement of property rights. See, the freezing of the accounts itself is already considered as a punishment, because you are already, your hands are already tied. You cannot perform your functions well. You cannot pay your bills, as complained by Bishop Tekis. So it is already considered as an infringement of property rights. And the base, as discussed by Kathy earlier, the basis of the freezing is also because of alleged association. Okay, so the right to free association is also affected, because in some cases, an organization that is alleged to be, for example, a front of an terrorist organization or a designated organization, even the members are also subject to the measures under the RA 10168. Okay, they can also, because anybody that would transact, okay, the so-called related accounts, anybody or any person that would transact with a frozen account could be also examined and checked by the AMLC. So it has a very broad reach. No, it does not only affect the persons whose accounts were frozen, but all those who attempt or transact with those accounts.
With those persons.
Yes, and so there is, by association, even your accounts will also be frozen. Did I also mention that the right to solicit or use funds to promote fundamental freedoms is part of the right to free speech? So that is also a limitation on the right to free speech. More importantly, the burden of proof is the freezing of accounts does not require criminal conviction. So even if the charge is financing terrorism, your accounts will be frozen with an undetermined period of time, and it does not depend on any criminal conviction, as long as the AMLC considers it that is being used to finance terrorism. That's it. No, so the criminal law is replaced by administrative procedures for freezing of accounts, and there is the judicial intervention only comes in when the accounts are already being forfeited in favor of the state. That is through a petition for civil forfeiture filed before the regional trial court. So in some cases, we only came to know of the basis for the freezing of the accounts when the civil forfeiture case has already been filed before the regional trial court. But that is already too late, because that would take more than 1 year already has passed, and you cannot have access to your accounts. So can you imagine that the activities are all also frozen, and the beneficiaries are also very much affected. So I would just like to emphasize that although RA 10168 provides that there is remedies can be availed for effective judicial protection, but I can say that there's not really, we cannot say that there is effective judicial protection under when your accounts are frozen, because the evidence are secret, the inability to defend your property rights at first instance, okay? Because you'll know it only at the end part, that is when the government is already getting your property
Yes.
in favor of the government. So those are, we cannot say that there is an effective judicial protection if you cannot avail it at first hand, okay, or at the earliest opportunity. So these are all challenges that we are facing and all organizations are facing whose accounts are being frozen. And there are very limited remedies.
Yes.
So it is quite, it is good to know that the reaction of organizations is to fight these kinds of oppressive laws and policies, and just not sit down and accept the fact that their accounts are frozen, but there should be a really an organized campaign and actions in order to challenge these repressive laws. And just for the information of everybody, actually yung RA 10168, or the powers of the Anti-Money Laundering Council to freeze and investigate accounts, has been amended by Republic Act number 11521, which is, the title is an act further strengthening the anti-money laundering law, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 9160. 9160 is the law that created the Anti-Money Laundering Council. Perhaps in a next discussion, this should be discussed, because there's the big difference in terms of procedure. Instead of, and one big difference is that instead of the AMLC issuing the freeze order, it was again transferred to the Court of Appeals. So perhaps they have they understood the concerns of many people's organizations. So a new law was passed. Actually, it became effective January, or it was signed January 29th of this year. And so they placed a judicial intervention so as to prevent the concerns that the people's organizations or individuals are raising regarding the freezing of accounts pursuant to RA 10168. So thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Attorney Rachel, for that very comprehensive answer. And I've learned a lot personally, and it seems that there are very sneaky maneuvers that the government and the legislation is currently imposing in order for you to have a very difficult time in defending yourself against this against the machinations of the lawfare and different ways in order to suppress dissent. Thank you so much, Attorney Rachel. Now, Joseph, I have a series of questions for you. In civic studies and research, is there a growing, emerging global trend on the use of counter-terror measures to restrict civic space? And another question is, are there examples in other countries that you can cite? And last question is, how can these impacted the overall state of human rights and democracy worldwide? Maybe you can answer the first question first.
Okay, thank you, Jermaine, and good afternoon to everyone. Before I get into some of the concerns by civicus on how counter-terror measures are being used around the world to impact on civic space, I must say that civicus has been extremely concerned about the deterioration of civic space in the Philippines for a number of years now, including the criminalization of activists and journalists, the shutting down of media outlets, the vilification and red tagging of activists, and so forth. And all this has led to Philippines' civic space rating being downgraded by the civicus in December 2020 from obstructed to repressive. We can see the space for civil society already shrinking. Now you add to this mix this particular anti-terror law, and this has further created a very dangerous environment for activism in the Philippines. The worrying overbroad definition of terrorism in the law, the powers for the security forces to detain suspects without a warrant, relaxation of accountability for law enforcement agents who violate the rights of suspects, and the broad role of the Anti-Terrorism Council, as many of you have already mentioned here, places people's fundamental liberties at considerable risk in the Philippines. Now, what are some of the trends around counter-terrorism measures globally? according to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, between 2001 and 2018, at least 140 governments adopted counterterrorism legislation. And many of these are for perceived threats. So governments using the post-2001 security environment to push for laws and additional powers, even though there were already adequate laws to deal with many of these crimes. So using the justification of the 2001 environment. Since the UN Special Rapporteur set up her mandate in 2005, at least 66% of all the information submitted to the Special Rapporteur have related to the use of counter-terrorism laws and policies on civil society. So this is an extraordinarily high proportion, which underscores the abuse and misuse of counter-terror measures across the world. In one study done by Frontline, the International Foundation for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders in 2018, 58% of human rights defenders have been charged across the world for counter-terror or security legislation. So you can see this pattern of governments resorting to counter-terror laws in order to go after civil society in many countries around the world. I would like now to talk about 5 tactics that we've often seen in our research of how governments have used these laws in order to go after civil society. And by no means is this comprehensive. There are many other issues that we can discuss here. So firstly is the broad and vague definitions in the laws across the world. So the global emergence of these vague definitions of terrorism that has been deliberately done and misused to target a variety of civil society groups, including human rights defenders, journalists, minority groups, labor activists, indigenous people, and members of the political opposition. So for example, in a country like Bahrain, terrorism has been defined as obstructing the public authorities in the exercise of their functions and damaging national unity. So extremely broad, and it's been used systematically to target civil society and their activities, as well as individuals allegedly providing information to such organizations. Another worrying trend that we see is the use of anti-terror laws to criminalize freedom of expression. So we've seen how states have used counter-terror laws to prevent reporting or to publicly discuss acts of terrorism through the criminalization of news and other materials likely to promote terrorism. So this has a tremendous impact on transparency and accountability of government officials and security forces when they commit violations in the course of countering terrorism. But this also has a very negative impact on journalists, on human rights defenders, but also of academic researchers, those trying to research about issues of terrorism. So for example, in Turkey, following the attempted coup in 2016 and the declaration of the state of emergency, 300 journalists were arrested and detained on grounds that their publications contain apology sentiments about terrorism. So going after journalists because they were writing about issues related to terrorism. So you can see the impact on freedom of expression. Thirdly, as many of the others have mentioned here, the vilification and smear campaigns. Of civil society is a defining factor in the closing down of civic space as a result of the post-2001 security paradigm. Therefore, the legitimacy of countering terrorism has enabled governments to brand civil society as terrorists, violent extremists, threats to national security, and enemies of the state. And by labeling them as such, it sends a clear signal that they are legitimate targets for attacks and legitimate further measures against them. So it's not just about them being targeted, but also their day-to-day lives are affected, their ability to find work, to get housing, and their socio-economic rights are also affected. And also, as mentioned here, their family members are also caught up in the stigmatization of these individuals. And what also is that governments are also using these particular terror laws to exclude civil society from engaging with international bodies like the United Nations. For example, the Al-Krama Foundation, an NGO in the Arab world on extrajudicial executions, disappearances, and torture, were denied accreditation by the UN following allegations by the United Arab Emirates that they had alleged ties to terrorism. So using this as a means to deter civil society from speaking up at the international level. Fourthly, we are also seeing the increasing use of judicial harassment of criminal proceedings against civil society during security legislation, and not just to arrest them, but also impose travel bans on them, to raid their homes and so forth. So in India, we see the anti-terror law there being used to keep people in pre-trial detention for nearly 3 years. So not ever been brought to a court, but being detained for long periods and to keep them in detention. In Egypt, these laws have been used to enforce disappearances against activists or put them on travel bans. So we're seeing the use of these laws to not just arrest individuals, but also put them through various judicial challenges in their work. And finally, as many of you have heard today, the targeting of NGO funds. We're seeing how counter-terror laws are used to block or delay funding for civil society. And one excuse often given by governments is to comply with the Financial Action Task Force in order to undertake such actions. And we see certain countries like Albania, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Venezuela all use this as a justification to block NGO funding. And what happens then? NGOs are forced to scale or close together. When their bank accounts are refused, their reputation is affected severely. And it also affects the salaries of staff as well as other beneficiaries. So we can see the broad impact of getting NGO funds. Now, this is a tremendous impact on your question on the state of democracy, because this particular tactics weakens the role of civil society to play a watchdog role of the state, as their funds are squeezed and their activities are worried about being targeted. It also creates a chilling effect in the media among journalists who is a pillar in a democracy to investigate and undertake reporting around the role of security forces. And finally, this counter-terror laws weakens the rule of law and limits the ability to ensure justice and accountability. So I'd like to end here by saying that the lack of respect for human rights by the executive in the Philippines, as we have seen, the impunity of the security forces, and weak accountability mechanisms creates a very rife environment for such anti-terror laws to be misused and to further shrink civic space. And I think it's important that we all, as civil society, push back on such forms of legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I'd like to reiterate on what you said earlier, the chilling effect that affects not only the media, but everyone. And in that respect, accountability and transparency is dead already, because no one will dare to act on the human rights violation. And because if you do that, you might be red tagged. And we all know what happens when the government red tags you. It dehumanizes you and it limits everything that you can do in the country. And eventually you might get imprisoned. Thank you so much, Joseph, for that. And thank you for your important views and observations, Ma'am Tina, Attorney Rachel, and Joseph. Indeed, the impact of these counter-terror legislation is so immense to the lives and liberties that one would think, if these are really meant to go after the real terrorists, because so far, and what we have discussed earlier today, the impact is on the state of democracy in the Philippines and elsewhere. Perhaps we have time for one or two questions. So we have two questions here from our viewers and our friends here on our Zoom space. First question is, what are your expectations on the resolution regarding the anti-terror law pending before the Supreme Court? I'd like to ask maybe Bishop Hamuel, Ms. Cathy, and Ms. Fides on your input regarding this matter. What are your expectations on the resolution regarding the anti-terror law pending before the Supreme Court? Any one of you po can answer. Ma'am Fides?
Yeah, okay, I would like to say, what? Optimistic pessimist, pessimistic optimist, no? Because I don't want to say blank no, I don't believe in it, forget it. In the same way, that I keep on getting emails from AMLAC, should I ignore them? They want to become my best friend. Okay, just lift the freeze order on Vic, no? I don't know really what's going on, but we have a sitting Chief Justice who's going to be sitting for how many more years moving forward, I just hope that he will be sensitive at least to the public pulse, that when you have so many petitions before you, he just cannot walk away from all of them. He cannot ignore them, and he cannot sit on them for long, which is the reason why right now, despite all the, and I suppose, walls have ears, the internet is porous, no? The AMLAC may be listening in, of course, because Karapatan and Tinay Palabay is here, no? So I know they are just, 2 minutes or 1 minute away from the same screen that we are facing, no? I would really like to wait for the Supreme Court to make a decision about the constitutionality of the ATA, because it affects BIC hugely, no? And him, Amihan, UCCP, Haran, and all those who may be similarly affected in the months to come because of the red tagging spree. And we should not even give a hoot whether Parlade is no longer holding office, because he is still right there, no, creating damage. And of course, there is my very good friend, no, Wiwi Badoy, no, and I don't know what has happened to her, but you know, I don't lose friends because of politics, no. And I hope she is listening in right now, that she should be helping, because I know for a fact, no, that she always says that she opposes martial law. So what is she doing when compensation accounts like Vic are frozen, and the Secretary General keeps on sending emails, no, to make me move, when, well, I just go to the bottom of it. I want to wait. I want to wait what the Supreme Court will do. I want to wait, and I want it done immediately.
Thank you, Ma'am Fides. Anyone else who wants to weigh in on the question? What are your expectations on the resolution regarding the anti-terror law pending before the Supreme Court? Are you optimist? Are you optimistic about it? Are you not really getting your hopes up about this? Anyone can answer po. Maybe Miss Kathy, you want to share po your answer on this.
Okay, sinususugan ko yung sinabi ni Ms. Fides, pero para sa mga magsasaka, sa malawak na bilang ng mga magsasaka na talagang apektado, mga biktima dito sa anti-terror law, kung negative man ang magiging pasya ng Supreme Court, inaasahan na yung buong mamamayang Pilipino na ang kailangan kumilos, no, para sa pagbabasura nitong anti-terror law. Nakita na namin after 1 year of implementation, napakatindi yung naging effect nito. So despite yung nasa Supreme Court, pinag-uusapan, tuloy-tuloy ang implementasyon ng NTF-ELCAC. So yun na lang ang inaasahan. Dapat buong mamamayang Pilipino ang manawagan, ang mamobilize, ang magkampanya para sa pagbabasura nitong anti-terror law.
Salamat po, Ma'am Kathy. Bishop Hamuel, may nais po kayong idagdag?
It is our prayer that our petitions handled by our petitioners will be achieved, and it will be heard by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will not only be centered on their own powers, but the benefits for the whole majority of our people who are living in a poverty situation. So this is our prayer na itong government na ito, there will be peace and justice in our midst.
Salamat po, Bishop Hamuel. We have another question po from our friends here on our Zoom page from Julie Smith. This is a very interesting question and might apply to all the CSOs here, you know, and also organization who wants to help out. What steps and strategies can external donors take to make it possible to continue to support their partners financially? I think this is born out of the issue of freezing accounts po, no, of some CSOs and POs. Anyone wants to weigh in on this question po? How can external donors continue to support their partners financially despite itong mga counter-terror measures po natin sa bansa? Who wants to? Sige po.
Okay.
Po, Ms.
Thank you, Julie, for that very nice questions. I think for donors who really want to help CSOs here in the Philippines, who are the real CSOs who helps the poor, who wants a change. I think these like donors can send a statement to the government, no, that they are, what do you call this, na talagang kinikilala nila yung gawain, no, ng mga NGOs, ng mga people's organizations na very important dun sa pang-araw-araw na buhay ng mga mamamayang Pilipino, lalong-lalo na yung mahihirap. So pwede silang mag-statement, no? Sabay-sabay silang mag-statement dun sa gobyerno at na yung itigil yung freezing, ilagay yung legitimacy ng mga people's organization na hindi talaga nagfi-finance ng terrorist work ng mga dito sa Pilipinas. Thank you.
Salamat po, Ms. Cathy. May nais po bang magdagdag? Anyone who wants to add on to that po? Ms. Tinay.
Hi. Thank you. And that question is really very important. No? Well, I guess one way by which donors can express their support for their partners here in the Philippines, and perhaps Joseph can also weigh in about this later, is to look at their own guidelines, no, on human rights defenders. I believe there are several governments who have these guidelines explicitly outlining their domestic policies, their policies in terms of development assistance in accordance to the UN human rights, the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and that includes the right of defenders to receive, no, and solicit donations or funds, no, for their work domestically. So in terms of revisiting these guidelines, we enjoin our partners, we enjoin everyone, no, to take a stand, no, with their partners here in the Philippines. I mean, it can be expressed in many ways. It can be expressed through the statements, through diplomatic representations, to continuing their dialogues with civil society here in the Philippines. And more importantly, I think there's a need to help in terms of developing protection mechanisms for human rights defenders, because this is a very dangerous time for many of us. So there are many steps that can be undertaken for sanctuaries, for those imprisoned. Jail visits can be conducted, trial monitoring observations can be done. So, but perhaps, of course, this goes on for another conversation.
Yes, opo. Thank you so much, Tinay. Same question to Joseph. How can international donors continue helping their partners here in the Philippines financially or otherwise?
I think the first thing that we are learning around the world is the need for donors to consistently talk to civil society. We assume this is the case, but many a time we are finding around the world there is no constant conversation, because the local communities actually have answers sometimes to some of the solutions around this. And I would encourage that happen on a much more systematic basis if it isn't happening already. Second, there are ways to look at alternative and more flexible ways of funding. I think around the world, we have many NGOs and donors are facing the same challenges. And I've been in conversations with Ford Foundation and other organizations to come up with much more creative and innovative ways to support civil society, particularly in countries where channeling funds to them has become more and more restrictive. And I think there are ways that people are trying to innovate in order to do this. I think thirdly is to help build the capacity of civil society to work within a much more hostile environment. What do they need? Do we need to build support them with more lawyers who can help them when their funds are frozen and so forth? And finally, I want to echo what Ine is saying, that we need donors to be speaking up, talking to governments, to parliaments, to the regulatory agencies, And I think, again, Civicus has been working with donors around the world to do more of this, and I in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for that input. All right. We have another question, and this goes to Attorney Rachel specifically. How do we protect our organization? Is there any remedy that CSOs can take before their accounts are frozen, especially if they are being targeted already? Like what you mentioned earlier, Attorney, no, I can only really address after a year almost, no, if the government has already acted on it. But in this case, are there any remedies that the CSOs or POs can avail to protect their organizations and their accounts specifically?
Well, as I've mentioned earlier, we have challenged the law to before the Supreme Court. So I think that is one big move that many organizations did. But right now, we can only go with the procedure. So it depends on the state or the status. The problem with the freezing of accounts is that it is an executive function. Okay, and there's not much judicial intervention. But I've said earlier, there is an amended a law amending the rights of the authority of the AMLC, and we can look into that because I think the freezing of the accounts is now transferred to the Court of Appeals. In that way, there is a hearing and there's a summary hearing where you can question now, and the procedure is more transparent and there is judicial intervention. So I think but that will apply to future cases, and we expect that future cases may also be filed against other organizations. It will not end with what's happening now. It will proceed. So we can continue studying the remedies available under the law. So as lawyers defending organizations and individuals whose accounts have been frozen, we actually use two approaches. First is we avail of the remedies provided under the law, however small or little they are. And at the same time, we also seek the help of the organizations themselves in campaigning against the repressive measures. So it's a balance of the political actions and the legal actions so that we could fight this very repressive measure and broaden the democratic space that we have right now. So in many laws and instances, it works. So maybe that is an approach that we can always try and continue opposing the repressive measures so that the democratic space would be broader for civil society.
Thank you so much, Attorney Rachel. We have one last question for our panelists here. And this is a question that we have. What is the effect of counter-terror military aid in countries like the Philippines in furthering human rights violation? What a very interesting question. Again, what is the effect of counter-terror military aid in countries like the Philippines in furthering human rights violation? Ms. Tinay, maybe you want to weigh on this?
Well, that is exactly the call of many of our solidarity partners, particularly in the US, in Canada, in Australia. No, I believe there are several groups calling for this, is to ensure that there's human rights compliance as an addendum, no, to military aid that is being given, or even trade policies. Because of course it is important to uphold the obligations of states worldwide on human rights. And one thing is that taxpayers worldwide wouldn't want their money getting spent on killing people here in the Philippines. That's basically it. I think anywhere else that would be the sentiment of many freedom-loving people. So in the Philippines case, it would have the biggest so-called supporter or provider of military and police aid would have to be the US. I think it has been more than 500 million in the past 4 to 5 years. no, and we see the many impacts of that. I mean, the recent tragedy, the crash, in Patikul Sulu is just one of them. I mean, you get substandard military hardware for billions of funds, but more importantly, the funds are being used to harass people, to kill people, to put people in jail, and that's misusing people's money, hard-earned money anywhere else, especially during this time of the pandemic. I mean, put it anywhere else, like buy vaccines,
Right.
health services, provide better compensation for health workers especially during this time. Money for the purposes of counter-terror laws used against citizens are just a waste of people's money.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much, Ma'am Tinay, and thank you so much to all our guests for your time and participation in this very meaningful webinar, and to all people who watch us here on Facebook. I'd like to end this webinar with these words. Dissent is not a crime. It is never a crime. It is our right to clamor for better services, for better governance, especially in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it is very appalling that the response of this government is to create laws and utilize the legislation to suppress dissent. We must remain vigilant in protecting our human rights, our rights to free speech, our right to live in a safe environment. We must always remember that activism is not terrorism. Huwag tayong kailanman pasisiil. Once again, I am Jermaine Halandoni de Ruña. Good day and keep safe, everyone.